The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. This is the Orange Cyberdefense Security Navigator webinar, where we will be delving into the report in more detail and asking, what does it tell us and what should we do as a result? My name is Stuart Reed, and I'm going to be your host today in this virtual studio that you see behind me. I'm also joined today by three special panelists, very close to the report. We have Charl van der Walt, Head of Security Research, Diana Selck-Paulsson, Threat Research Analyst, and Wicus Ross, who is a Senior Researcher. And all of these together will be walking us through the Security Navigator's key findings. We are live, so our panelists are also joining us live from different locations, from Sweden to South Africa to the UK. So this really is a truly global effort. If you do have any questions as we go through today's webinar, then please do join in the discussion. On your right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see a questions box. Please do use it, type in your question, and we'll do our very best to answer as many as we can. Now, remember, of course, as always, the Security Navigator and other rich sources of information can be found at our website, orangecyberdefense.com, where you can also get in touch with a team member to explore your individual needs. So please do get in touch. And as a reminder, we are live, so anything can and probably will happen. So if we do have any disruptions during our broadcast today, please do consider it as part of the overall rich experience. So without further ado, I would like to firstly turn to you, Charl. This year, it has to be said, has been an absolute record year for the Security Navigator in terms of the number of downloads we've had. So can you remind us, what is the purpose of the Security Navigator and who's it really aimed at?
Thanks, Stuart, and hi, everyone. You know, for a moment there, when you said we are live, so anything ... I thought you were going to say, you say can be held against you in a court of law. My mind must be in the wrong place.
Your naturally suspicious mind, Charles.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I want to answer your question. No, Stuart, thanks. Yeah, we're very pleased with this year's Navigator. Not only are we extremely happy with the amount of attention that it's gotten, but we're happy with the product itself. I shared with my team earlier this morning a direct message I got on social media from an ex-colleague of mine who was saying he thought it was as good as the Verizon Navigator report. Now, I know you're not supposed to compare yourself with other vendors, but we really are aiming to have, an absolutely world-class product. And that's been a journey for us for some time, and we really think we're getting there now. So it's a pleasure to be able to talk about it. The document is not only remarkable in terms of the amount of coverage it's gotten, but also in terms of scope. It runs 90 pages. And I know that's a big ask for anyone to plow through. So to people who haven't invested time in it yet, I want to just point out that it's one of the things we try and do is to really tap into the diversity of insight and data sources that we've got. And Diana will talk to you a little bit about how we tease all of that out. But the way to read the Navigator is I think, to skim through the table of contents first, and then to get a sense of where we're talking about what, because there's CyberSOC incident data in there, there's vulnerability management data in there, it's from our incident response teams, it's from our pen testers, there's a lot going on. As to the why, I believe that as a business, and I think our team reflects this value, we want to be a part of the solution, and one of the ways that we can contribute, I believe, in an authentic and meaningful way to the security discussion and to our sort of collective efforts to solve the security problem is by sharing some of the data and the insights that we have. Now, there's a lot out there already. We don't want to compete with that. What we want to do is identify those insights and those experiences that we've had that are valuable, that are authentic, and can genuinely contribute and present them to people who have to make decisions and develop strategies and decide how to spend their resources. So that's the point.
Great. Well, thank you. And I mean, can't emphasize too much the fact that there must be a huge amount of work and effort that's gone behind the scenes. From what you've said, there's a huge amount of content in there, and we'll talk about some of the key findings in just a few moments. But first, starting off, and Diana, maybe if I can turn to you on this point, how do you go about gathering and sorting and then analyzing all these vast amounts of data?
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. Yeah, it's quite an undertaking, I would say. We work with a very diverse data set, and the way we usually start is to just reach out to all the CyberSOCs, but also the operations teams with a quest of helping us select the data for that report. By doing that, we have really great conversations, a little bit nerdy into incident management. As you can see now on the screen, we have a breakdown of all the events that we're processing, and when does an event become an incident, and when is it actually confirmed or not confirmed. And it's really great conversation that we have around that with the people and the teams that basically help us. And we are choosing, or we have chosen 45,000 plus incidents to meet the threshold of this year's Navigator report. And once the data is collected, it's it can be actually quite overwhelming. You see the first time the whole data set, and you just you realize on how much you have been working on as a whole, as an organization. But also, what could be interesting for the reader to see or to read, and what could we dive into, basically. So the way we start is that we start getting familiar with the data set, and we do that by doing what we know. We sort it into groups. For example, we look at last year or the previous year, and it's been really challenging this time because we ourselves have undergone changes, right? So it has added to the data set, and that's why it became quite diverse. And then we look at what sticks out, and we kind of do a trend analysis. We look at the timeline, for example. So we start from January to October most of the time. Is there any month that has a specific increase or decrease, for example? Why did March or April see a dip? Why have we seen more social engineering? Is that specific to a region, or is it globally that phenomenon that we see? Is there any vertical that is overrepresented, and if so, is it a specific incident type? So you see, it's a lot of questions that needs to be answered, basically, and we're trying to do both. We're sorting the data the way we know it, but we also let the data lead us to our findings.
Great. Well, thank you, Diana. And as a follow-up question to that, sorry, Diana, I seem to have lost you there. Just as a follow-up question to that, you did mention verticalization as part of the discussion just then. Are there really big differences between the industry types that we're seeing here? Are there any particular patterns that you're recognizing or we should be aware of?
Yeah, I would say yes and no. Despite the specifics that we're diving into in the Navigator report, and that I will also be diving into just in a minute, I think it's important to acknowledge that cyber attacks and cybercrime does not really discriminate against specific vertical, your geolocation, the business size one belongs to, and I mean there is a fair chance that one can become a target, right? Secondly, every vertical is very different alone in its nature, and that might be the reason why we see different incident types at our customers. And then lastly, what we're seeing is what we're monitoring, right? So it really depends on what we're looking for. So in a way, you could say that we're a little bit biased, and I think that is also important to acknowledge. And the statement that I just made is really just focusing on the CyberSOC statistics chapter from our Navigator report. I don't want to generalize it to the other case studies, but it is the case for the CyberSOC statistics. And if we go back to that data set, basically what we're seeing now on the screen is that the data that we analyzed, we have 10 different verticals. And the most represented by amount of customers in each group is finance and insurance. And this is followed by manufacturing and professional services that actually take the spot 2 equally. And then we have healthcare, and healthcare is not on top 3 or 4. We just want to dive today into healthcare because it's been a very special year for them. So I will be diving into 3 of them, and I will start with healthcare. So it's been a very tough year, if you can say that, for healthcare, and that is not just because, you know, the most obvious reason that we have a global pandemic still ongoing. It is also because despite the promises that were made by some groups not to attack this vector, we have actually seen exactly that. It's been extremely busy for them in activity and in frequency, and also globally. There is no specific region that has been targeted extremely much. And for this vector, historically, they have seen much more insider threats than from outside, external. But in 2020, it might be the year where we've seen actually a shift, where we've seen more external threats to that vector. And that is most likely due to ransomware attacks that we have witnessed. Another interesting factor is that in 2020, we've come the closest so far to a physical impact. So since a few years already, we are kind of, you know, predicting that we're going to see physical impact and that it's, you know, going to hurt at one point. And we have seen this now during a cyber attack at the German hospital in Düsseldorf, who was not able to accept a patient, and therefore the patient had to go to another hospital nearby and did die on the way due to the severe injuries. And just to put it right, the aftermath or the conclusion was that it wasn't a direct impact, since that patient had 2 severe injuries, but it did show us a little bit of what is going to happen in the near future. The second vector that I'd like to dive into real quick is finance and insurance. And in comparison, they're very different to healthcare. They have a much higher proportion of external threats. And they're facing financially motivated attacks most of the time. What we're seeing in our data and also externally at reports is that they have a higher proportion, a much higher proportion of social engineering attacks than other verticals, and more specifically phishing attacks is their initial attack vector. And that is most likely due because they work with very sensitive data. So does healthcare, and so does, you know, any other vertical as well. But it does make them an attractive target, especially when we look at the data-centric attacks that we have seen now in 2020. And then manufacturing as the last vertical I'm going to dive into. Manufacturing is no exception, right? They work with sensitive data as well, and they are potential target to data extortion that we have seen now in 2020. And this vertical kind of faces both. They face attacks that are motivated by financial gain, but also by espionage. And they stick out in our data set because they have been, they are quite representative, right? They are on the second group where we have most of the customers, but we actually have the highest incident volume in this vertical. And that means that this vertical keeps us the most busiest. When diving into this, we see that, you know, 1/3 of all their incidents are malware related.
Thanks, Diana. I mean, it's really interesting to see some of the differences between the verticals there. Charl, if I can bring you in at this point, because what I'm keen to understand is, in terms of the differences that we are seeing between the verticals, is the data actually saying that there are some industries that are not targets for, I don't know, say ransomware, or is it actually perhaps suggesting that some industry types are better equipped to detect them?
Yeah, it's a great question, Stuart. you know, when you do data analysis, what one finds is it's often easy to find correlations, but it's much harder to prove definitively cause and effect. So as you say, you know, we'll often note that we're detecting certain things more in one vertical than in another, but it's not always clear, and I think it would sometimes be a reach to suggest that that means that that industry is being more targeted. You know, I think as Diana's also said, there's several reasons why the data may show that. Having said that, there are examples that do stand out, and Diana touched on manufacturing, for example. I'm not teasing them out for any given reason, but it just is a sort of a counterexample to that concern. So manufacturing constitutes about 18% of our customers, but about 30% of our incidents. So there's, you know, clearly there's something stands out there. And not only that, but what you're seeing in the chart on the screen there, but when we look at actually confirmed ransomware incidents, now bear in mind in our definition of an incident as ransomware, that means, you know, encryption has been triggered somewhere. You know, we're not talking about the intent of the actor. You know, something has actually happened. Then manufacturing alone makes up 50% of all of those incidents, and that's a standout statistic right there. And then finally, if we could just jump to the next slide, this data tracks data leak sites. So this is not directly from our incidents, but what we see the attacker doing, you know, in the dark web and on the internet. And there, the green line is sort of showing the prevalence of manufacturing businesses compared to other industries, which are little colored lines on these sites over time. And again, you'll see towards the end of last year, you know, manufacturing just really stood out as being as falling victim more often. So sort of supporting what our own data was saying. Again, you know, so I think we can conclude with some confidence that, you know, manufacturing is falling victim more often, whether that's because they're being targeted more or whether because their, you know, security controls are failing more often. That's of course not a conclusion that this data would allow us to draw.
No, thanks for that, Charl. And you touched on it just there, and I'd like to just elaborate on that a little bit more, because I am aware that we do detect within this report, you know, against multiple places along the cyber attack chain. So does this have an impact on what or how we're able to report on these things?
Yes, of course, and I think Diana touched on this somewhat earlier when she spoke about the bias. You know, when we say bias, you know, it's not that we kind of favor one incident over another, but of course we can only report on what we see, and what we see comes from the telemetry that we distribute across the optimized to see to detect indicators, if you like, at different phases of the kill chain. And where we detect things obviously has a bearing on, you know, what the data then ultimately says to us. And there's a very interesting data point which sort of illustrates this dynamic in action. I think it allows us to draw some interesting conclusions. We can maybe jump to the next slide. And it has to do with the prevalence of confirmed ransomware incidents. So in the chart we're sharing here, which is from the Navigator report, you see the volume of confirmed ransomware incidents over time. And you'll note that they sort of climbed towards Feb. They stayed quite high over the lockdown periods, which is interesting to note. So over the you know, the core of the phase one of the pandemic, and then dropped after that, almost disappeared. Now, what's important to note about ransomware is we detect and classify an incident as ransomware as a final stage strategy. So that's what the attacker does when they've got their backdoors installed, they've harvested credentials, they've moved laterally as much as they can. Then they trigger ransomware. So it's right at the end. You know, if you're getting ransomed, then everything else is basically failed, I suppose. The other line shows what we call droppers or downloaders, and it includes Emotet, which really resurged in July. You can see that kick at the end as Emotet campaigns, you know, really just being reawakened during that period. But what we found interesting about this is that there appears to be a kind of a divergence of the two lines after the end of the lockdown period in May. So in May, we see confirmed ransomware starting to drop, even though droppers, which are early stage in the kill chain, right? So kind of the second thing that you do is you put your dropper down so you can download your second stage and move laterally, etc. Those seem to be going up. So these are two incidents that we're detecting at very different places in the kill chain. And what we think is happening here is that during the lockdown, the sort of IT and security world was experiencing what we've come to call COVID fatigue. You know, we were distracted, we were solving crises, fighting fires, doing all kinds of things. And so the early stage detections that we notified our customers of were not being verified by them and therefore are not appearing in this data. So this data shows verified incidents, which means the customers confirmed, yes, we've seen that, and hopefully they've taken care of it. So the verified incidence of early stage attacks was relatively low during that period, simply because we think customers weren't in a position to respond to what we were telling them, about early stage and perhaps, more benign looking things. And at that time, of course, what happens is that those early stage attacks are allowed to progress to later stage attacks, which is why you get the fully fledged ransomware developing. And our hypothesis is that after lockdowns, when life started sort of returning to normal, businesses were able to respond more quickly to the early stage attacks, which shows those incidents going up because they're now verified and confirmed by the clients. Whereas ransomware in its final stage starts dipping down because the attack is never progressing that far. Long answer to a short question, Stuart, but I found this data point very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually what you underline there as well is absolutely the rich source of content that there is within the Security Navigator. And I think the explanation from both yourself and Diana in terms of bringing that data and the analysis of that data together is actually really powerful. So I guess with all of the content that is in there, and I'll open this question to everyone, but if I start with you, Charl, if I may, what are the key findings of the report? Did you find anything that particularly surprised you?
Yeah, my colleagues are sick of me because I'm absolutely fascinated by one data point in this report. And it's interesting because people who are following the news or subscribe to our World Watch service would have been notified today about a breach of a very prominent security product vendor who was compromised using vulnerabilities in their own products. And that kind of really hit me in the face, because for us, the standout, or for me personally, the standout finding of this report actually has less to do with incidents and more to do with vulnerabilities, and specifically vulnerabilities in security technologies. And what this chart is showing with the two lines is the number of formally disclosed vulnerabilities, or what we call CVEs. Firstly, for all technologies in the NSA's database. So that's the orange line you see there. They track the same period. And the blue line shows the number of vulnerabilities disclosed over the same period for a specific subset of leading security product vendors. And what you see is that over May, as we would expect because of the COVID fatigue that I referred to earlier, there's a significant dip in the number of vulnerabilities that are reported overall. Simply, I suspect because people just, weren't getting to the admin of, processing those things. But at exactly the same time, the number of vulnerabilities reported in the subset of security technologies almost doubles. And then, that graph is just like one of the most interesting inverse correlations I've ever seen. And we ascribe this to basically to three things. The first is a kind of an osmosis effect amongst researchers, and we've got a very nice visualization with the timeline in the report that shows how we believe the thinking around a vulnerability spreads in the researcher community. And I think at this point in time, it just happened to be spreading from researcher to researcher. The second is, of course, there was this remarkable escalation in the use of these perimeter technologies. As everyone had to suddenly accommodate all their remote workers, there's a rush to roll these technologies out. And I think researchers and attackers suddenly started paying attention to technologies that they may not have been thinking about before. And then finally, what we discovered, and again, this is a data point we share in the Navigator, is that as businesses became more and more dependent on these technologies, as they became more and more mission critical, you couldn't afford to just take them down or patch them or be reckless in your patch management. And so these vulnerabilities were remaining exposed for a much longer time. And so in fact, not only did we see much more of these vulnerabilities, but we saw some very prominent high profile compromises and breaches happening because of them. So for me, this is probably the most interesting data point, and there's the story surrounding it in the report.
Absolutely, I appreciate you sharing that with us, and yeah, the graph that you're showing there is pretty compelling, and there's been no shortage of high-profile breaches that have taken place, which really shows the opportunities or the vulnerabilities that can be exploited. So thank you for that. Wicus, if I could bring you in to the conversation now, please. Is there anything in the report that particularly stands out and resonates with you?
Stuart, good afternoon, good day, good afternoon, everybody. Stuart, yes. In the report, actually, I would like to highlight two of the articles in there. One which is quite, I think, very close to everybody, and everybody's gotten very comfortable with it by now, I guess, is video conferencing killed the video star, or rather, video conferencing, yeah, called the conference star, in the sense that everybody has been exposed to collaboration software over the last couple of years by now. I mean, coming March would be a year that we've been basically isolated here in South Africa. Or lockdown, as they call it some places else. And our team, once they started evaluating all these different platforms, quickly realized how diverse and feature-rich some of them are, and that made it quite difficult for apples-to-apples comparison. One of the vendors we looked at, namely Zoom, was a vendor that attracted quite a lot of attention for many reasons, good and bad. But it was also unfortunate, because I think what we learned from our research is that many other vendors share similar challenges. It turns out that doing video conferencing well and making it easy to use and getting it to comply with security and regulatory requirements that typical enterprises require is actually hard. One feature, or the lack of some features for some, as well as the ambiguous language around it, namely encryption, it attracted the ire of many. But also specifically end-to-end encryption, turns out that everybody wants it, but I don't know if everybody really understands the implications of having true end-to-end encryption. It turns out that privacy and confidentiality, it's very good, but it handicaps other features. For example, audit information sharing, data loss prevention type of analysis. It makes that type of thing quite difficult, because through end-to-end encryption, nobody besides the two parties or the parties, get access to the information. Also, end-to-end encryption requires PKI infrastructure, and that doesn't extend necessarily to guests joining a conference or a channel, for example. Also, public switch telephone networks break the whole idea of end-to-end encryption as well, because it's siphoned out over a non-encrypted channel for some. So what we've learned through that, what I would like to highlight through that is, understand your products, understand what the capabilities are, and it's good to know all the bells and whistles are there, but understand the limitations for most. I think that's a universal approach to most products that we have in the security field. Another article, another topic that we discussed was on cybercrime, specifically a Dummy's Guide to Cybercrime. And in that article, I'd like to highlight the fact that we are actually at the start of that whole journey, and our ambition is quite high, quite big, shall I say, and in the fact that we want to take this quite far. The cybercrime landscape is ever changing, and I think everybody is quite well aware of how complex it is. And in this article, we highlight the ecosystem and the dynamic nature of all the relationships. And work that we're doing currently is creating like a cybercrime mini site. That's a type of a database or visualization of this whole interaction and relationships and interdependence that these actors have on each other. So look out for that. We'll announce it in hopefully Q1. We'll have it up and running for everybody. But it's the whole idea is there to make it interactive and more visual. But what you do when you see this interaction, like with the image on the screen with all the interdependencies, you notice that these actors all work with each other and buy here, buy there, sell there. It's like it's quite a smorgasbord of activity. And recently, last week, we saw an article published on a dark marketplace being taken down, aptly named Dark Market, and actually was done by German prosecutors. But when you read the whole article and you read the backstories to many of how it came to that point, you realize it's quite a big law enforcement exercise involving agencies and jurisdictions from the United States, Australia, Britain, Denmark, Switzerland, Ukraine, and Moldova. So it's quite widespread, and it shows you how borderless cybercrime is, in the fact that for these law enforcement agents, they have to work according to the letter of the law and according to the book, which means they have to follow certain procedures. And when you start crossing borders, it becomes quite a challenge, and you have to get more collaboration, where dark market operators or cyber criminals, for that matter, don't really, don't care, right? They can set up shop where they want. And interesting thing about this arrest that they made and the seizure of this dark market, they actually caught the brains behind the operation. Allegedly, it's a 34-year-old Australian man at the German-Dutch border, and they had to seize infrastructure, bulletproof hosting type environment in Ukraine and Moldova, which hosted the servers and the rest of the data, I guess. And that was done through a seizure of a NATO bunker that was repurposed by somebody also for hosting dark markets. So there's a whole chain of events that had to lead up to that. But what we've seen about cybercrime is that, especially dark markets, is that somebody just pop up and fill that space now. So you have this whack-a-mole type of approach. So for us, with the cybercrime database and the work we're trying to do is to show everybody that this is really a problem and it's not that easy to solve. And hopefully with this approach, we can get people to think creatively about addressing certain aspects of the cybercrime ecosystem, and maybe we can systematically destroy it somehow.
It's fascinating to see actually the diagram that you've got there, Wicus, that kind of shows the interdependencies and the complex nature of the ecosystem. So thank you for sharing that. And Diana, lastly from your side, is there anything particular from the report that you'd draw reference to?
Yeah, I think I have two things that really stuck out for me. The first thing is that we noticed that small and medium-sized organizations had quite an increase in incidents and also in distribution. And what that means is that we started to look into why we see more incidents for those business sizes. And as you can see now on the screen, when looking into, again, malware-related incidents, we've never seen as many incidents for small organizations and medium-sized organizations. So it feels like they have caught up with the amount in proportion, of course, to large organizations. And diving a little bit into this, we noticed that there is quite a large amount of adware or potentially unwanted programs, it's called. And while this is not extremely severe, it means that someone has downloaded something that is potentially not allowed by policy or potentially malicious. It did stick out because the increase, or like the high amount that we've seen, and we haven't seen such a high amount before. And our theory to explain why that is basically that in March we saw that increase, and that is typically the time where the global lockdown started. So our theory was that this is most likely due to the fact that people started to set themselves up at home, and they started to remain, or they tried to remain efficiency, and that's why they most likely downloaded some things. And then one more thing in this area regarding business size, when looking, okay, so who caused this increase for small and medium sized organization? We saw again that manufacturing really stuck out regarding confirmed malware incidents. So the 25% that we see here now, or the 23% in medium-sized businesses. The other thing is that when we look at what we expect versus what we actually saw. So last year was a big event politically, like the US election, and we really expected more disruption than we might have seen, especially APT activities, so advanced persistent threat actors, and that was especially evident by the action by former President Trump, who had fired the director of CISA, which is Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Christopher Krebs, who was fired after he had stated that this was a relatively calm election, there was no voter fraud. So that didn't really happen, right? What we saw, what we didn't expect is what you see right now on the screen. The ransomware and how it's, how they innovated the actors behind it. So they have, as we already mentioned a little bit, they have established like their own websites, either in the dark web or in the clear web, and they are posting, all their clients / their victims to expose and to shame, and that's something new. That's kind of raising the pressure, and that is nothing that we have expected to see, but really took off in 2020. So what we're seeing here right now is what we have stated in the Navigator report. And that was published just a few weeks ago, right? But it's changing so much. Those groups or those actors are switching gears very quickly, and it's very agile. So what we're seeing now, when just looking at Q4 that we have missed before, and until last week, I think it was when I pulled this data, is already a very different picture. So one of the groups, for example, Maze, has Keys Operations. They are new players in the game right now. So it's very agile. Yeah, so that's basically two of the findings that I found most interesting.
Great, and I think it kind of leads on quite neatly to my next area of questions, which is the market is dynamic, the landscape is dynamic, and of course no more dynamic than of course the pandemic that the world has faced with COVID-19 and the impact that it's had on day-to-day lives, but also on cybersecurity postures. So the data, of course, was collated here over the course of 2020. So did the pandemic really have as great an impact on security postures as some perhaps expected? Charl, if I ask you that question.
Yeah, that's again a fascinating question, and I kind of have to agree with Diana here. Some of what was the most fascinating was what we didn't see. We didn't see that wave of APT attacks rolling across. We really don't believe that the threat landscape shifted in a meaningful way to target home users yet. COVID was used as a lure as we expected, but not in a way that significantly changed the field. And one of the data points that we spent an extraordinary amount of time on, I remember Diana and I arguing about this for many hours, is this graph that you see on the screen now. So can I just ask if people can mute? There seems to be a bit of an echo now. But what this chart does is to compare the number of incidents we recorded for our customers in Sweden with the number of incidents that we recorded for our customers in France. France being the red line at the top, of Sweden being the orange line at the bottom, and the gray block showing the sort of rise and fall of nationwide lockdowns across our area of operations. And we did this because we were trying to understand something we very clearly saw, which is that in fact, over lockdown, instead of the surge of incidents which we had expected, there was a very notable decrease in incidents over the lockdown periods. And by comparing France, where there was a very strict lockdown, to Sweden, where there was not a very strict lockdown, we were able to see that there was really a direct correlation between between the lockdown and its effect on business and the volume of incidents that we saw. And we were able to make some other comparisons that are included in the Navigator also of different regions. And it really shows something which in retrospect is quite obvious, which is that so many of the incidents that we're able to detect, of course, require some sort of user interaction, or at least require a computer to be on and connected to the network. And with furloughs, extended vacations, lockdowns, etc., there's just less of that, and therefore less activity. Having said that,
thanks, Charl. And I guess the other thing that's worth noting as well is that towards the tail end of 2020, as well as the global pandemic, we did see the SolarWinds incident, which is of course something we should mention here. Is there anything in the Security Navigator data that might have been an indicator to this? And again, I'll open this up to the rest of the panel, but Charl, if there's anything of note from your side.
Stuart, if I may, I just want to invite Wicus just to remind us what the what the SolarWinds incident was for for anyone who hasn't had it thrown at them by 1,000 vendors already.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, SolarWinds is probably something that everyone that's tuning in today is familiar with, at least on the periphery. So yes, Wicus, if you can give us kind of a view of what that is and remind us the kind of the summary of the incident itself.
Yeah, I'm just going to keep an eye on the number of attendees because I'm sure people are sick of hearing this. But certainly, I'll stop when I see the numbers drop below a certain value. The whole, I think, coming back to your question about did we see this in the Navigator, I think it's very difficult to predict a single event, but our state of the threat model talks about various aspects. And one of those aspects that we've carried through the years on using that model is the talking about interdependence or supply chain types of attack. And I'll allow Charl to talk more towards that. And I'll just quickly glance over the incident, SolarWinds incident. I'll just give like a whistle-stop tour of it. So come around about 7-8 December, FireEye announced a breach, and then shortly thereafter, Reuters broke news about a breach at certain US agencies. That was quickly followed up by FireEye that actually said, well, we were breached with a supply chain attack through SolarWinds Orion platform. And then thereafter, I think just a news flurry of activity, and as happens, FireEye's description of what happened, and the way they broke it down was actually very good, explaining the backdoor process of the SolarWinds Orion platform. So we learned through that analysis of a backdoor called Sunburst, which was actually used by a attacker or a group of attackers to actually then drop something called Teardrop, which then led to a beacon called Cobalt Beacon, which was a type of tool, remote access tool that allowed hands on keyboard type of operation. So that then pivoted into various other lateral movements inside organizations. SAML tokens got forged through very clever use of what they call the golden ticket or golden cert type approach, where they can get access to a on-prem AD that's linked to an ADF Active Directory federated service sitting on Azure cloud, and then because the two are linked, you can create access for yourself on the cloud, and you can gain access to email inboxes, etc. So based on that analysis and the fact that there was so various amount of kill switches built into this whole process, and the very selective nature, it was quickly classified as a espionage operation, not a malicious actor that looked to, on the level of NotPetya that went and wiped everything out. The attackers seem to be very selective, very prescriptive in the way that they approach it. Very good OPSEC. Earlier this year, we learned from CrowdStrike that there was something to do with the build environment on SolarWinds. There was a backdoor or a implant discovered called Sunspot, and that was responsible for swapping out the source code files during the build process. And that's how this Orion platform DLL or .NET assembly file got actually signed as well, with a malicious backdoor inserted in it. That operation started around about September 2019. As a start, they suspect that was like a test run, and then the full operation was around about March 2020, June 2020, and then the actor started cleaning up after himself. And the rest is history. And I suspect we're going to learn a lot more. I mean, I probably didn't cover everything in detail, but I mean, there's so many other excellent sources out there that covers it in great detail. But that's more or less the gist of it.
Thanks for that overview, Wicus. I think it's, we often hear about a lot of things in the press, but it's always useful for us to have that context set. So appreciate that. And from your side, Charl, is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I think Wicus touched on it. Your question was, does our data point to it, or did we mention the Navigator? And so unfortunately, or fortunately, the Navigator got out, published just before this broke. About a month before. So, we don't explicitly reference it, but what we do in the Navigator and just about everywhere else where we write or talk, and maybe we can flick to the next slide, is reference something we call
I think we've lost your audio there, Charl.
Organize. Hello?
Hello, you're back.
Did you have me at all, Stuart? Or
no,
am I back?
Okay. We caught
Yeah,
the beginning, but we moved to the slide, and then unfortunately we seem to have lost connection.
Sorry, my carrier pigeons are getting tired. So we use this model called the state of the threat as a thinking tool to organize our understanding of the threat landscape, and to reason and argue about what we think will emerge, what's going to happen as a result of what we're seeing. And in that state of the threat model, we do in fact predict supply chain attacks, and we've been watching them trend upwards over the course of the last 5 quarters. Of course, people have been asking me a lot, so I've been pointing that out. But more importantly, I think we track the systemic factors that we think contributed to SolarWinds having happened and more SolarWinds coming. And those systemic factors are the scope and scale of investments by governments into cyber espionage and other kinds of cyber operations, the underinvestment by businesses into security, which results in the accumulation of security debt, and then a factor Wicus referred to, which is interdependence, which is just that by its nature, IT and security forces us to link together. And so you kind of think of the supply chain as, up to your suppliers and down to your customers, but it's much more nuanced, it's much more networked than that. So every time security fails in one place, it has downstream effects for someone else. And those systemic factors, we talk about a lot, and we think SolarWinds demonstrates them in action.
Great, thank you for that. And we talk about analyzing the threat landscape a lot and the changing dynamics. We've touched on 2 kind of external factors that perhaps influence that. In the way that you analyze the findings for this report and also for the wider research that you're involved in, what would your advice be to customers?
I think we can flick to the next slide there. Stuart, for me, and maybe I'm just getting old and cynical, but for me, it's about agility. I think we need to put ourselves in a position where we anticipate and expect and are comfortable with a volatile, unpredictable context. Where new things are coming at us left, right, and center, and we need to adapt very rapidly. And there's a security philosophy that's emerging now that captures that way of thinking, which is called intelligence-led security. And it's really about maintaining continual situation awareness across the entire landscape, and then positioning yourselves with platforms, people, and technology respond in whatever way is appropriate. And I think that's the kind of thinking that we're going to need to carry us through the next next few years of the security challenge.
Thanks, Charl. And if I open that question up to the rest of the panel, so Diana, if I could bring you in at this stage.
Yeah. I think the way we observe, how threat actors are evolving today and how they have evolved in 2020, it's nothing new, right? Like if we look at the double extortion scheme, for example, it's as a single behavior, it's something that we've seen before. But what is new is to adding it on top of each other, right? And increasing the costs and also increasing the pressure for the victims, for the organizations. And I do think, once you're in these situations, it's really hard to get out of it. So my recommendation is to really be proactive instead of reactive because of that. And then secondly, I think what we're seeing, for the finance sector, but also for small and medium-sized organizations, is that one of the main attack vector is phishing, and that is often due to user behavior, right? So we're looking at the humans, at the employees, and it's something that we can work on. And I think we need to invest a little bit more there into the human, into the employees, to just make them more knowledgeable, let them into IT security knowledge, and make them more aware, basically.
Great, thank you. And Wicus, thoughts from you?
I have to agree with Diana's last statement about security is everybody's problem. It's not just the IT department or the security, the CISO's problem. It's a company-wide thing, and this is a cultural change that I think businesses need to make sure that they can instill in everybody. So equip people, develop staff. Make sure that they understand why certain things happen, how it can happen. They don't have to know the technical details, but if you can make it fun for them, you can make it interesting. I mean, people learn quickly, but phishing is a problem. It is, people's going to click links, and you have to have processes or technology in place that can help identify where there was a misstep. And that comes back to the detect and respond argument about, make sure you have adequate monitoring, you have endpoint protection, that, something that can at least cover some of the bases for you. The concept of least privilege come to mind. Make sure that people, only have the minimum privileges that they need to perform their task. For example, macros in certain products. Why do you need macros? Everybody in the organization needs macros. Yes, there are still people that heavily use macros, but make sure that you have compensating controls for that, and that you treat those users differently. The idea of making idea of everybody having the same risk profile, people should review that. And in some cases, security or cybersecurity is not companies' core competencies, or they're too small, or they feel they don't have, they want to get people to help and invest in that. So that's why you include professional consultancies or managed security services providers to help with that, even if it's just for guidance, even if it's just for advice. But this is a very complex thing, and I think Diana might have touched on it earlier, saying this is evolving landscape. It changes, it's agile, it's quick, and we have to keep up with it. And sometimes certain businesses just not equipped to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Wicus. And I noticed we've packed a lot of content in today's webinar. We're coming towards the tail end of our webinar today. But before we go, I did want to perhaps open up the discussion in a bit more of an interactive way, and everyone will be familiar with kind of the notion of predicting what's going to happen next, and we've touched on some of the things that did happen in 2020 within the report, but is that going to be an indicator for what's happening next? So what I'd like to do is open up to everyone that's tuning in today a quick poll to see which one of the predictions that our panelists will give resonates particularly with them. And actually, I wouldn't mind kicking off with one of my own on the basis of what we've been hearing about the Security Navigator today. And it's quite clear that cybersecurity is becoming far more in focus with the board, and with that, it does feel to me that perhaps cybersecurity is going to be a driver front and center for commercial success moving forward. A lot more companies are embarking on digital projects. Global pandemic and environmental factors have certainly driven and accelerated that. I would suspect that it is those projects that have got cybersecurity embedded at the heart of them that are more likely to get sign-off quickly, and also more likely to be successful and have longevity. Perhaps if I could move to you, Wicus, to get your view on what yours might be.
Stuart, I think mine is just going to be quite straightforward. I mean, I think the way that the pandemic has changed and the way that everybody is now adapted to that, we're fortunate that we have mature cloud technologies and platforms that allow this transition for everybody to do telecommuting, or at least not telecommuting, just remote work for that matter. So that in itself, attracts attention of attackers, attracts attention of people trying to find, weaknesses and prod at the seams. So I think cloud technology or cloud infrastructure is going to definitely get attention from various attackers. We've already seen it with the S3 buckets leaking data all over the place, so that's not new, but all sorts of misconfigurations and that type of thing is going to become problematic for people. And just the humble, remote worker sitting at his home, and maybe running a out-of-date access point or home router that's never been patched, still running default credentials, whoever. But the attackers are going to pivot and trying to find all sorts of ways of getting into organizations, etc. And I think cloud infrastructure and home users are definitely going to start getting a lot more attention this year.
Thank you. And Diana, what's your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I do believe that we will see more of the data-focused attacks, unfortunately. And as I mentioned already a little bit before, is that it's been extremely successful by, attackers that are motivated financially and somewhat independent. So it's unlikely that this is going away. I think also what might happen is that it will attract much more beginners that don't really have the technical know-how, but they kind of can buy a component as a XYZ as a service and just execute it themselves as well. So I think we will see more of that, and that means that organizations kind of need to invest into more data-centric approaches as well.
Thank you. And Charl, your thoughts?
Stuart, for me, I think security is a complex, multifaceted problem, and I think the technology failures that we see resulting in breaches and compromises are sort of a symptom, not a cause. And so I think until we collectively as an industry start understanding and tackling these systemic drivers, I don't think that any of the trajectories that we're on at the moment are going to change. We're going to be here in a year talking about more extortion attacks, more leaks, more data theft, etc. Technology on its own is just simply not enough.
Great, thank you. So what I'd like to do is open it up to everyone that's tuning in, just to get your thoughts on which one resonates with you. You'll see on the right-hand side of your screen there's some voting buttons for you to select. So please do select the one that that you think is one that you expect to see this year, or indeed, if you think there's going to be something completely different, please also type that into the question box. And while that's taking place, one thing that I would like to do, I did notice we have a question that's popped up here that I'll throw out to the panel. Any thoughts on the much dreaded prospect that AI will create new and potent threats potentially on the fly? What's the thoughts of the panel there? Perhaps Wicus.
Stuart, I can answer that. Charl, I saw you typed in the chat that you wanted to handle this.
Well, I was going to refer to your expertise, actually, Wicus. I thought your RSA were.
We'll tag team on this one then.
All right. So, I mean, I have to also give credit to a former colleague, Etienne Greef. It was his brainchild and his hard work, and I don't want to ride in his coattails. but I definitely want to highlight the work that he did and I helped him with. Is the fact that you get the motto that we believed in is the saying that our AI is definitely more suitable to offensive than defensive. So that is a different view on what the industry has done to date with AI. We did an RSA talk in 2019, February 2019, about topic modeling, and I think the talk's name was Rise of the Machines. But it is on RSA's website. Go to 2019. Go look for Etienne Greef and Wicus Ross. I was at that stage still under a different company, Secdata, before he got acquired by Orange. So what we said is AI definitely favors the attacker, the offender, in many cases, because it allows for such amount of automated processes to happen when applied in a very judicious way. So I think AI, we haven't seen that yet. There was a competition a couple of years ago. DARPA sponsored it at DEF CON, where they had all these automated systems attacking and defending each other, and that was quite a nice eye-catching event, and definitely showed that people are thinking about it. And we definitely also believe that attackers are going to they're going to cotton onto this, and they're going to start using aspects of AI, especially when you're starting to look at volume, where Diana talked about data-driven approaches and stuff. Topic modeling, for example, is something that can help you get a sense of what data you're looking at and focus your attack purely on certain aspects of let's say, you want financial data, you tell the malware go hunt for financial data, and it'll go and do that for you. Topic modeling, for example, as a unsupervised type of machine learning technology can do that for you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that, Wicus. I've just noticed that our poll results have come in, and an interesting spread of opinion here. Certainly, there is a bias towards technology alone won't be enough to mitigate threats. I think we've covered some of that as part of our discussion today, and absolutely couldn't agree more that it's a layered approach to cybersecurity that really shows that resilience piece. Again, more attacks targeting cloud infrastructure and home users. Perhaps that's not to be surprised, given the way that a lot of people have moved into that kind of remote working situation, and also cloud. So it'll be interesting to see when we come back with our webinar reflecting on this year's Security Navigator, whether some of those predictions were indeed what translated, or if it was something else. So thank you very much for everyone that voted there. Also, thank you very much to the panel. It's been a fascinating conversation today, and with a huge amount of insight. I hope you'll agree that for those of you that have tuned in. All that's left for me to say is thanks again to my panelists, Diana, Charl and Wicus, and of course to all of you joining us live for today's broadcast. We will also make sure that today's session is available on demand. So if you would like to rerun it or suggest it to a colleague or a friend that couldn't make it, then please do let them know. It will be available to download at leisure from our website, orangecyberdefense.com. Also, quick reminder, there is lots of rich information, including the rerun, as I mentioned earlier, of today's webinar, but also other webinars available on demand, and a rich source of other content, all on orangecyberdefense.com. So please do check that out. Until next time, it is goodbye from me. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and see you again soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.